1. e4 immediately fights for central space and opens diagonals for the queen and king's bishop, setting the stage for dynamic and open play. This move initiates the Sicilian defense, a dynamic and unbalanced opening that immediately challenges white's central pawn and seeks to create counterplay on the queenside. This move develops a knight towards the center, preparing to castle and control key squares, directly challenging black's pawn structure and leading into the popular Sicilian defense. This move transitions into the French defense, strategically preparing to challenge white's central pawn on e4 with the d-pawn and open a diagonal for black's light-squared bishop. This central pawn push immediately challenges black's pawn chain and aims to open the position for white's pieces. This capture is a fundamental choice in the open Sicilian, embracing a more open position where rapid development and central control will be paramount for both sides. This move recaptures the central pawn and opens lines for white's pieces, establishing an active presence in the center typical of the advance variation of the Sicilian defense. This move prepares to undermine white's d4 pawn by potentially playing b5, and it also grants the queen access to the b6 square, a common strategic idea in this variation of the Sicilian defense. This move, developing the bishop to d3, is a common and solid response in the English variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to prepare kingside castling and support a central pawn push or development of the other pieces. This move develops the knight to a central square, contesting white's control and preparing to castle, while also supporting the d-pawn, which is a standard response in the French defense variation of the Sicilian. This capture, nxc6, simplifies the pawn structure and eliminates black's central pawn majority, potentially creating an isolated pawn for black after d5. This pawn recapture creates a doubled c-pawn, which opens the b-file for black's rook and strengthens central control, but at the cost of pawn structure weaknesses that white may later target. Castling kingside secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a crucial step in activating your pieces after white's pawn structure has been altered. This move breaks open the center, aiming to challenge white's pawn majority and gain space, but it also potentially weakens black's queenside pawn structure after white captures. This move opens the c-file for white's rook and aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, creating potential weaknesses on the queenside. This move develops a knight to its natural square, simultaneously challenging white's central pawn on d4 and preparing to castle, reflecting common themes in the advance variation of the Sicilian defense. This move opens lines and creates an isolated queen's pawn for black, potentially leading to dynamic imbalances and attacking chances for white on the kingside. This recapture opens the c-file for black, creating an imbalance with doubled pawns for black and white's open c-file that will become strategically important. This move resolves the pawn tension in the center, opening the e-file for potential activity and creating an unbalanced pawn structure where white has two central pawns to black's one. This move recaptures the pawn, opening the e-file for white's rook and creating a doubled pawn for black on the c-file, which can become a strategic target. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies control of the d5 square and prepares to challenge black's central pawn majority, aiming to exploit the weakened queenside pawn structure created by white's doubled c-pawns. This move logically develops the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing for kingside castling and supporting the central pawn structure. This move exploits black's slightly uncoordinated development by forcing the king to move or a piece to be sacrificed, gaining a tempo while disrupting the pawn structure. This move correctly blocks the check with the queen, but it also centralizes the queen and prepares to recapture the pawn on d5 if white chooses to do so. This move, re1, repositions the rook to the only open file, preparing to support the d-pawn and potentially control central lines as the game transitions to a middle game. This move forces a queen trade, simplifying the position and leading to a more open endgame where white's knight on c3 will have significant activity. White recaptures the pawn, simplifying the position and aiming to exploit the doubled c-pawns which may become targets later in the middle game. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, connecting the rooks and preparing to challenge white's central pawn control. This move develops the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control the important d4-h8 diagonal and prepare for potential kingside play or support a central pawn push. Developing the king to safety is paramount in this symmetrical pawn structure, preparing for future pawn advances and central control. The bishop moves to c5, directly challenging black's weakened dark squared diagonal and aiming to exchange itself for black's potentially problematic knight on f6, thereby improving white's piece activity. The move (16) rfe8 is a solid repositioning of the rook, aiming to activate it on the central e file and support the potential advance of the d-pawn, while also defending the e6 square. This exchange simplifies the position by removing a bishop, creating doubled c-pawns for black, and freeing white's pieces. This move repositions the rook to a more active square, preparing to contest the semi-open e-file and potentially support a pawn advance on the kingside. This move initiates a queenside pawn expansion, aiming to gain space and potentially create a passed pawn on the b-file, while simultaneously preparing to redeploy the knight to a more active central square. The king moves to a more active central square, allowing the rook to potentially swing over to the kingside or support a central pawn push. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, aiming to pressure black's queenside pawns and potentially support an advance on the queenside. The bishop retreats to c8, preparing to reposition to the a6-f1 diagonal to support a potential pawn advance on the queenside, and contest the open c-file. This move prepares to support the d4 pawn and potentially create a kingside pawn majority, but it weakens the light squares around your king and may hinder piece development. This move prepares to redeploy the rook to a more active file, aiming to contest the central d-file or support a potential kingside attack. This move activates the rook, preparing to challenge the e-file or potentially swing over to the kingside to support the knight, and pressure black's queenside pawn structure. This move develops the bishop to a more active diagonal and prepares to challenge white's control of the a-file, aiming to create counterplay. This move forces a favorable exchange for white, eliminating black's active knight and simplifying into an endgame where white's superior pawn structure and potential for piece activity will be more pronounced. This exchange of queens leads to an endgame where black aims to exploit white's doubled c-pawns and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. This move prepares to challenge black's rook on the c-file, aiming to exchange pieces and simplify into a more favorable endgame where white's slightly better pawn structure might prove decisive. This move initiates a strategic maneuver to redeploy the rook from the vulnerable b-file to a more active central position on the d-file, aiming to contest control of this important open file and potentially create attacking chances against white's king or queenside pawns. This move places the rook on the 7th rank, creating pressure on black's queenside pawns and potentially limiting the mobility of the black king. This move strategically repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to contest the central file and potentially support a pawn push or counterattack. The move re2 repositions the rook to a more flexible square, preparing to challenge the d-file and potentially support a pawn push on the kingside, while also freeing up the other rook for defensive duties. This move prepares to reinforce the kingside and potentially support a future kingside pawn advance, or create space for the king to maneuver away from the open c-file. The king's advance to f2 aims to centralize the monarch, improve its defensive capabilities, and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside to create dynamic play. This move prepares to challenge white's control of the open c-file and potentially create counterplay on the kingside by advancing the kingside pawns. This move advances the kingside pawn structure, aiming to create space and potential attacking opportunities while also reinforcing the f3 square. This pawn push advances the kingside initiative, threatening to create weaknesses on black's kingside as white's f-pawn becomes more mobile. Kf3 aims to centralize the king, preparing to actively participate in the endgame by supporting potential pawn advances and defending weaknesses. This move prepares to contest the crucial central squares and create potential space for the knight, while solidifying black's pawn structure. The king's central advance aims to activate the monarch, escape passive positions, and potentially support pawn pushes in the endgame. This pawn thrust opens lines for the black pieces and challenges white's central pawn structure, aiming to create dynamic counterplay. The king ventures into the center, aiming to become an active participant in the endgame and support the pawn majority on the queenside. This move intends to redeploy the knight to a more active square, aiming for c4 or d5 to influence the center and potentially attack white's pawn structure. This move intends to create a passed pawn on the h-file by leveraging the king's maneuver to support the advance of the g-pawn, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances. This move is a tactical blunder as it allows white to fork the knight and the rook on the d6 square with the king. This move initiates a king hunt, aiming to force the black king into a vulnerable position, potentially leading to tactical opportunities or forcing material concessions to escape discovered attacks. Black correctly retreats the king to avoid the discovered attack on the g7 pawn and to unblock the f8 square for potential future piece activity. This move activates the rook to the 7th rank, threatening the knight and preparing to exploit the open c-file. Black captures the advanced pawn on b4, a tactical decision that aims to disrupt white's queenside initiative and gain material equality. But it also requires careful calculation to avoid defensive weaknesses. This move, bc4, aims to contest control of the c4 square and potentially prepare to centralize the bishop. But it overlooks the immediate tactical opportunity presented by the exposed white king and the potential for black to exploit the open d-file.